The adoption papers slid across our polished kitchen table with a sound like ice cracking. Mom's signature, a tight, angry knot of black ink, was already dry. She didn't push them toward me with regret, but with the brisk, impersonal efficiency of a bank teller closing an account. 23 years of my life, from scraped knees to high school graduation photos on the mantelpiece, were being liquidated for the return of their real daughter, Chelsea. "We've thought about this long and hard, Maya," Mom began, her voice devoid of any warmth. "When we found out Chelsea was alive, we knew our lives had to be completely dedicated to her healing. It wouldn't be fair to her having you here. It would be a constant reminder of what she lost." I stared at her, my mind struggling to connect her words to the woman who taught me how to ride a bike. A reminder? I'm her sister. I've dreamed of meeting her my whole life. Mom's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "You're not her sister. You were the girl we raised in her place. Now she's back. And we need to restore the family to how it was always meant to be. This paperwork just makes it official." The air was thick with the ghost of Chelsea. Her perfume, an expensive and cloying floral scent, clung to the curtains and the upholstery, a territorial marking. She had been standing right here just moments ago, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips as she'd watched Mom sign the papers before excusing herself to let the family have their moment. She had swept through the house an hour earlier, trailing my parents like a visiting monarch, pointing at furniture and suggesting renovations. She'd paused at the door to my bedroom, her eyes glinting. "This room has the best light," she had declared. "I'll take it." There was no question, no hint of sharing or compromise. It was a hostile takeover disguised in a pretty, smiling package, and my parents had handed her the keys to the kingdom without a second thought, eager to please the prodigal daughter they barely knew. My hands were trembling so violently I had to press them flat on the table to steady them. I forced my eyes to focus on the dense block of text, the cold, sterile language of the law. The phrase that leaped out felt like a physical blow, relinquishment of parental rights. "This can't be real," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "You can't just erase me. I'm your daughter. I have been for my entire life. That has to mean something." Mom sighed, a sound of pure exasperation, as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum. "Don't be so dramatic, Maya. We gave you a wonderful life, didn't we? We took you in. But you must understand, you were a substitute. A lovely one, we thought, but a substitute all the same. Chelsea is our blood. The original is back, and frankly, we can't afford to support you both. Her needs are extensive." "Maya." Dad spoke for the first time, his voice rough. He wouldn't meet my gaze, focusing instead on a spot on the wall just over my shoulder. "Your mother's right. This is about blood." I turned to him, a desperate, final appeal welling up inside me. "Dad, please, look at me. Just look at me and tell me you don't want me anymore." He flinched, but his eyes stayed fixed on the wall. "You have until tomorrow morning to pack," he said, the words coming out in a low, rushed monotone. "Chelsea is moving into your bedroom tonight. She needs to feel like this is her space, her home. So you need to have your things cleared out. Be gone by 10. Mom nodded sharply. "Don't make it any harder than it has to be. We're already emotionally exhausted from the reunion." A strange, cold calm washed over me, drowning the panic. The grief was still there, a massive, tearing hole in my chest, but the shock had crystallized into something hard and clear. Resolve. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of its legs against the tile loud in the suffocating silence. As I reached down to grab my purse from the floor, my fingers brushed against the crisp rectangle of paper tucked into the side pocket. The lottery ticket. It crinkled softly, a tiny secret sound only I could hear. I stood up and looked at the two people who had just auctioned off my entire existence. They saw a broken, discarded daughter with nowhere to go. They saw their problem quietly preparing to vanish. They would never, ever know what they had just lost. "Fine," I said, my voice steady. 10 o'clock. I sat in my beat-up sedan in the driveway, the engine silent. The keys weren't even in the ignition. For a few minutes, I just breathed, watching the familiar cracks in the pavement and the overgrown rosebush Dad was always meaning to trim. This car, this driveway, this house, They were the only constants I had ever known, and they were being ripped away from me with the casual cruelty of tearing up an old photograph. But the numbness was a shield. Behind it, a plan was taking shape, fueled by a rage so cold and pure, it felt like a superpower. I pulled my purse onto my lap and took out the lottery ticket. It was a flimsy, crinkled piece of paper that held the weight of my entire future. My fingers were surprisingly steady as I flipped it over and dialed the number for the state commission printed on the back. The phone rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. State Lottery Commission, this is Daniel speaking. How can I direct your call? My own voice came out even, almost unnervingly so. Hello, Daniel. I need to claim a prize. I believe I have the winning ticket for the Mega Millions jackpot from last Tuesday. There was a polite electronic beep as he switched modes. Certainly, ma'am. I can help you with the initial verification process. Do you have the ticket with you now? I looked at the slip of paper, the numbers I had memorized, the numbers I had checked a dozen times online in the dead of night. Yes, I have it right here. The screen door to the kitchen slammed open, making me jump. Mom stood silhouetted against the light, her hands on her hips. Maya, what on earth are you doing out there, pouting? Get back in this house right now and help Chelsea settle in, she called out, her voice sharp with annoyance. She can't decide if her vanity looks better against the east wall or the south wall, and she needs a second opinion. I held the phone tighter, turning away from her so she couldn't see my face. I'm on an important call, Mom, I said into the receiver, loud enough for her to hear. Sorry, 1 second, I whispered to Daniel. Mom scoffed, a sound that carried easily across the lawn. An important call? With who? That boy from the library? Maya, this is not the time for childish games. Your sister needs you, your real sister. She's had a traumatic life, and the least you can do is help her arrange her furniture. Stop being so incredibly selfish and get in here. The word sister felt like a shard of glass under my tongue. She wasn't my sister. She was my replacement. And I was not selfish. I was surviving. I'm busy making arrangements, I called back, my voice hardening. The double meaning was a small, secret pleasure. As the words left my lips, the front door opened again, and Dad emerged, his shoulders slumped. He was carrying my 2 large suitcases, the ones I'd used for college trips and family vacations. He didn't look at me. He just trudged down the walkway with the grim determination of a man taking out the trash, his face a mask of weary resignation. He reached the curb and set them down with a heavy, final thud. My entire life, my clothes, my books, my memories, was now officially garbage waiting for pickup. The sight should have broken me, but instead it forged the final layer of steel around my heart. Ma'am, are you still with me? Daniel asked, his voice a lifeline back to my new reality. I watched Dad retreat back into the house without a single backward glance. Yes, I said, my voice clear as a bell. I'm here. Let's continue. All right, ma'am, Daniel said, his tone patient and reassuring. Let's proceed. Could you please read the 20-digit serial number located just above the barcode? I read the numbers out slowly and clearly, my eyes tracing the path Dad had just worn in the lawn. Thank you. And now, the 6 winning numbers from top to bottom. I recited the sequence that was now burned into my brain, a sacred prayer. 4, 16, 22, 41, 68, and the mega ball is 12. There was a pause filled only with the soft clicking of his keyboard. It felt longer than a lifetime. I could hear Chelsea laughing inside the house, a high, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. She was probably directing Dad on where to hang her art, covering the nail holes left behind by my life. Okay, ma'am, Daniel's voice returned. The numbers you've read are an exact match for the winning ticket drawn last Tuesday evening. I just need to ask a few more security questions. Can you tell me the location where you purchased the ticket? The Quick E-Mart on Hudson Avenue, I answered instantly. Last Monday morning. Another pause. And your name for our records? Maya, I said. My name is Maya. The formality of it all was surreal. Outside, my family was erasing me. In here, on this phone line, I was being born. Well, Maya, Daniel said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. On behalf of the State Lottery Commission, it is my distinct honor to be the first to officially congratulate you. You are the sole jackpot winner. The full, unclaimed prize is $18 million. The words hung in the air of my small car, seeming to push out the walls. The ticket was set to expire in 3 days, he added. You claimed it just in time. 3 days. A cosmic joke. They had given me 24 hours to disappear from their lives, and the universe had given me 72 hours to start a new one. The lawyer's office downtown was a world away from the suffocating tension of my former home. It smelled of old leather and expensive coffee, a scent of power and order. I had been here for an hour, sitting across a vast mahogany desk from my new lawyer, a sharp woman named Miss Albright, and the private investigator she had hired on my behalf. The investigator, a calm, graying man named Mr. Jones, had just finished his preliminary report. The $18 million had worked faster than I could have imagined. On the desk between us lay a thin folder, but its contents were heavy enough to shatter a family. So let's be perfectly clear on what we've found, Miss Albright said, steepling her fingers. The woman calling herself Chelsea presented your parents with a forged birth certificate and a fabricated story, which we've already debunked. The hospital she claims she was born in has no record of her or her supposed birth mother. More importantly, we ran the DNA. She slid a lab report across the desk. I acquired a sample from a hairbrush your mother bought for Chelsea, which you retrieved from the guest bathroom trash. We compared it to a sample from a coffee mug your father used, which you provided yesterday. As you can see, there is a 0% chance of a paternal match. She is not your father's biological daughter. She is, for all intents and purposes, a complete stranger. Mr. Jones cleared his throat. She's more than a stranger, Miss Albright. She's a professional. This isn't her first time. We've found a pattern of behavior, a specific modus operandi, targeting families with documented histories of lost or adopted out children. She finds vulnerable parents, ready to believe in a miracle, and she bleeds them dry. The words hit me, but not with the pain I expected. The betrayal from my parents was a gaping wound, but this new information was a bizarre, almost clinical balm. They hadn't traded me for their real daughter. They'd traded me for a phantom, a con artist. The door to the conference room burst open without a knock. Chelsea swept in, my mother and father trailing anxiously behind her. She had her performance face on, her eyes already glistening with manufactured tears. "Maya, there you are," she cried, her voice trembling beautifully. "Your mother told me you wanted to see me to what? Apologize? I forgive you, of course. I know this must be so hard for you." She rushed toward me, arms open for an embrace, clearly expecting me to crumble in front of our parents. She stopped dead when she saw the table. Mr. Jones had, on cue, neatly arranged a series of 8x10 glossy photographs across the polished wood. They were surveillance shots. Chelsea at a pawn shop, selling a silver locket that had belonged to my grandmother. Chelsea meeting a man in a parking garage, a man whose file identified him as a known forger. Chelsea under a different, brassier haircut, laughing outside a courthouse in Ohio. Her eyes, the same predatory eyes I'd seen in my own home, widened in shock. The fake tears evaporated instantly. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice losing its delicate tremor. "What is all of this?" My mother looked around flustered. "Maya, what is the meaning of this ambush? You told us you had papers to sign. We came here in good faith." "You can't prove anything," Chelsea snarled, the words ripping through her sweet as sugar facade. Her voice was suddenly hard, stripped of its practiced vulnerability and coated in a venomous rage. It was the voice of a cornered animal. She jabbed a finger at the photos. "Those are fake. Photoshop. You did this. You were always jealous of me from the second I walked into that house. You couldn't stand that they loved their real daughter more than they ever loved you, their little charity case." She wheeled on my parents, her face crumpling back into a mask of anguish. "Mommy? Daddy, don't you see what she's doing? She's trying to poison you against me. After all those years I spent dreaming of you, she's trying to tear us apart all over again. You can't let her. You can't." She was good, I had to admit. The performance was masterful, each word chosen to prey on their guilt and their desperate need to believe in her. My father looked pale, his gaze darting between the photos and Chelsea's frantic face, confusion warring with a lifetime of gullibility. Maya, sweetie, you're being incredibly dramatic, Mom said, rushing to Chelsea's side and putting a protective arm around her. Hiring a lawyer? A private investigator? This is a family matter, not some television show. You've gone too far. Chelsea, honey, don't you worry. We know who you are. But her words lacked conviction. I saw her eyes flick down to the papers next to the photos, the forged birth certificate, the bank statement showing a large withdrawal from my parents' savings account, the background check summary. Her hand, the one she had resting on Chelsea's shoulder, began to tremble. It was a small, almost imperceptible tremor, but I saw it. The first crack in the foundation of her new perfect family was showing. Look at the documents, Mom, I said quietly, my voice even. Look at Exhibit A, the birth certificate. Mr. Jones can show you the 7 different forensic markers that prove it's a forgery. Mr. Jones spoke, his voice calm and devastatingly quiet in the tense room. He picked up another document from the table. Ma'am, he said, addressing my mother directly but loud enough for everyone to hear. Perhaps you'll find Exhibit C the most illuminating. He placed it in the center of the table. Your daughter has been married twice, under 2 different names. We have the official state certificates. 3 years ago, she was Jessica Miller in Dayton, Ohio. She married a widower who, 6 months later, discovered his retirement fund had been completely drained. He then slid another paper next to it. And before that, she was Emily Thorne in Savannah, Georgia. She convinced an elderly couple she was their long-lost granddaughter. They signed their historic home over to her. She sold it, and they haven't seen her since. Both families filed fraud reports, but she had already vanished. Does any of that sound familiar? The room fell silent, save for Chelsea's ragged breathing. All the air had been sucked out of her righteous indignation, replaced by the stark, ugly truth laid bare on a lawyer's table. My father slowly sank into one of the plush leather chairs, his face ashen. My mother stared at the marriage certificates, her trembling hand flying to her mouth. The architecture of their grand delusion was collapsing in on them, beam by painful beam. Chelsea said nothing. She just stared at me, her eyes filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. All the lies were gone, and only that remained. For the first time in 2 days, I felt like I could breathe again. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large office windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. It felt warm on my skin, a gentle, honest heat that was a world away from the cold, conditional affection I had grown up with. The light in this room full of devastating truths felt more real, more welcoming, and infinitely warmer than my home ever did. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Dad was a statue of disbelief in his chair. Mom was still clutching the fraudulent marriage certificates, her face a mess of confusion and dawning horror. Chelsea, or whatever her name was, stood rigid, her mask of victimhood shattered, revealing the cold, hard fury beneath. The next sound was not the explosion of screaming I expected, but a firm, authoritative rap on the conference room door. Miss Albright, my lawyer, gave a sharp nod to her assistant, who opened it to reveal 2 people, a man and a woman, dressed in professional but unremarkable clothes. They weren't lawyers. Their eyes scanned the room with a practiced, all-seeing gaze that bypassed everyone until they landed on Chelsea. Sharon Riley? The woman said, her voice calm and carrying no hint of a question. Chelsea flinched as if struck. The name, so unfamiliar to the rest of us, was clearly a direct hit. We've been looking for you for a long time. My mother gasped. Sharon! Who's Sharon? This is our daughter, Chelsea. Officers, there's been a terrible mistake. My other daughter, Maya, she gestured at me with a trembling hand, as if I were the source of all this chaos, has made some wild, unfounded accusations. The male detective smiled, a thin, humorless expression. Ma'am, I assure you, we know exactly who we're talking to, and we're not here because of any accusations made today. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. Sharon Riley, you have an outstanding warrant for your arrest issued by the state of Oregon on charges of felony embezzlement and wire fraud. Chelsea spun to face my father, her last desperate gamble. Daddy, don't let them. It's a lie. I've never even been to Oregon. Tell them who I am. Dad rose unsteadily from his chair, his face pale and slick with sweat. Officer, my daughter, she was kidnapped as a child. She's been through a terrible trauma. She gets confused. His voice trailed off, the lie sounding pathetic even to his own ears. The female detective took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Chelsea. Sir, your daughter was the head bookkeeper for a lumber distributor in Portland for 3 years. Over an 18-month period, she embezzled over $200,000 by creating a ghost employee and wiring the salary to an offshore account. She vanished the day before the annual audit. We have payroll records, bank statements, and security footage of her leaving the office with a box of files. We're not confused. She unhooked a pair of handcuffs from her belt. The metallic rasp was deafening. Sharon Riley, you are under arrest. Chelsea didn't scream or fight. A chilling transformation took place. The panic vanished, replaced by a flat, dead-eyed resignation. She knew this script. This was the end of the show. She turned her back on my parents without a word and put her hands behind her back. The sharp, definitive click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed in the silent room. It was the sound of the fantasy dying. It was the sound of my parents' monumental, life-destroying stupidity being made real. And as that sound registered, my mother's eyes rolled back in her head. Her body went limp, and she crumpled to the plush carpet in a dead faint. The detectives were efficient and impersonal. While one read a stoic Chelsea her rights, the other called for a uniformed officer to wait downstairs. Paramedics were offered for my mother, but Dad, in a daze, waved them off. She just needs a minute, he mumbled, staring at the spot where Chelsea had stood. They escorted their prisoner out, leaving a vortex of silence in their wake. For a long time, nobody moved. Mr. Jones, the PI, began quietly packing his files into his briefcase. Miss Albright poured a glass of water from a carafe on the sideboard. Dad finally knelt beside Mom, patting her cheek. Honey, can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered open. She looked around the empty room, her eyes settling on the vacant space by the door. She's gone, she whispered. They took her. Then her gaze found me, standing by the window. A new, terrifying thought was dawning on her face. The realization of what they had done, not to Chelsea, but to me. The weight of it seemed to crush her. Maya, she sobbed, the word a raw, open wound. Oh God, Maya, what have we done? Dad looked up at me, his face a ruin. Maya, we didn't know. I swear to God, we didn't know. She fooled us. She fooled us completely. I just stared at them, a spectator watching the final tragic act of a play I was no longer in. The pain they felt was a distant echo, a storm happening on another continent. What are we going to do? Dad asked, his voice cracking. He was looking at me as if I had the answers, as if I could somehow fix the world they had so thoroughly broken, as if I were still his daughter, there to solve a problem. There is no we, I said, my voice as calm and flat as the horizon. Not anymore, you signed the papers. Mom let out another wrenching sob. We can tear them up. We'll tear them up right now. It doesn't mean anything. You're our daughter, Maya. You've always been our daughter. We made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. Please, sweetie. Please, we can fix this. No, you can't, I said. It wasn't cruel, it was just a fact. You can't fix this. You just have to live with it. I picked up my purse from the chair where I'd left it. You wanted a clean slate, I reminded them, using Mom's own words. Now you have one. Dad struggled to his feet. What are you talking about? Where are you going? He pleaded. You can't just leave. We're your family. We need you. I looked at my lawyer, Miss Albright, who gave me a subtle, encouraging nod. The final piece of my plan fell into place. I have a flight to catch tomorrow morning, I announced to the quiet room. First class to Zurich. I'm moving to Switzerland. The shock on their faces was absolute. It was even more profound than when the handcuffs had clicked shut. This was a blow they hadn't seen coming, a consequence that had never entered their minds. Switzerland! Mom shrieked, pushing herself up onto her elbows. How? With what money? You can't afford a bus ticket to the next town. I didn't answer her. I didn't have to. My silence was its own kind of power. I looked down at my mother, a weeping mess on the expensive carpet, her face streaked with mascara, her carefully constructed world in smoldering ruins around her. I saw Dad, his hands fluttering uselessly, his gaze darting between his collapsed wife and the daughter he was now losing for a second, final time. A part of me, the little girl who had spent 23 years craving their unconditional love, felt a flicker of pity. The part of me that had sat in the car while my father carried my life to the curb felt nothing at all. He took a staggering step toward me. "Maya, please," he begged, his voice raspy. "Help your mother, just help her get to a chair, please." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had called me a placeholder, who had told me to be out of my own home in 24 hours, who had stood by and watched a grifter claim my room, my life, my family. I remembered her cold, dismissive signature on the paper that had legally and emotionally severed me from them forever. I turned my back on them both and walked towards the door, leaving her on the floor. I walked back into the house alone. They had followed me from the lawyer's office in their own car, a silent, miserable procession. The place already felt alien. A half-unpacked box of Chelsea's garish trinkets sat on the coffee table, and a hideous faux fur throw blanket was draped over the arm of the sofa. It was a cheap stage set for a play that had closed on opening night. Ignoring them, I walked directly into Dad's study. I knew where they kept the important files. I didn't have to search. Sitting right on top of the filing cabinet in a brand new folder labeled with Mom's neat, cursive script were the documents. I picked up the folder. "Chelsea's Educational Trust Fund," I read aloud. Mom flinched. Dad just stared, his face gray. I opened it and pulled out the thick sheaf of papers, the official statements for a brokerage account I knew intimately. Without a word, I walked over to the shredder by the desk and switched it on. The machine whirred to life with a hungry growl. "Maya, what are you doing?" Dad asked, his voice cracking. I fed the first page into the slot. "Just cleaning up a few loose ends," I said calmly. The machine whined as it devoured the page, spitting out neat, useless strips into the bin below. "This account," I said, holding up the next page. "It looks familiar. Oh, right. It's the one you told me was financially unfeasible when I wanted to go to art school 2 years ago, remember? You sat me down right at that kitchen table and gave me a lecture on fiscal responsibility." I fed another page into the shredder. "You told me my dream was too expensive. A frivolous luxury you couldn't possibly afford." Another page gone forever. But for her? For a complete stranger? A professional con artist you had known for less than a week? You were ready to hand it all over, no lecture required. "Maya, please," Dad begged, taking a step toward me. "Stop. We can fix this. We didn't know who she was. It's not fair to throw that in our faces." He sounded pathetic, his voice watery with self-pity. We were victims, too. I stopped feeding the shredder and turned to face him, the last page of the trust documents held tight in my hand. He looked so small, so utterly diminished from the towering figure of authority I had known my whole life. The anger I felt was no longer hot. It was glacial, a vast and immovable weight. The sound of the shredder's motor was the only thing holding the silence at bay. His excuse was so flimsy, so cowardly, it was almost insulting. He was trying to hide behind his own foolishness, pretending ignorance was the same as innocence. It wasn't. What he and my mother had done wasn't just a mistake born of naivete. It was a choice, a deliberate and calculated decision to discard one person in favor of another. Her identity as a criminal was almost irrelevant to the core of their betrayal. It didn't absolve them of anything. In fact, it only made their cruelty more pathetic, their judgment more bankrupt. They hadn't just been fooled. They had been willing participants in their own deception because the fantasy she offered was more appealing to them than the reality I represented. "You knew who I was," I said, my voice low and cutting. I let the final page of the trust fall from my fingers and walked past them, out of the study and into the guest bedroom. My carry-on suitcase was open on the bed. "You knew I was your daughter every single time you helped me with my homework at the kitchen table. You knew I was your daughter, when you taught me to drive in this very neighborhood. You knew my favorite color. You knew I was allergic to strawberries. You knew I had nightmares after watching horror movies. I began stuffing clothes into the bag, my movements sharp and efficient. You knew me for 23 years. She was a stranger. Her being a con artist doesn't change what you did. It doesn't erase the fact that you looked at me, the child you raised, and you decided I was disposable. I pulled a crisp, professional-looking travel wallet from my purse. I unzipped it and pulled out a stack of documents, making sure the letterhead was visible. You made a choice. You signed a paper to throw me out onto the street with nothing. I shoved the papers into an inner pocket of the suitcase. These are my new Swiss bank statements. I'm making a choice too. The money, Mom whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. She had followed me to the doorway, leaning against the frame as if she didn't have the strength to stand. The lawyer, the flight to Switzerland. Maya, where did you get that kind of money? Her mind was scrambling, trying to find purchase, trying to find an angle, a weakness. She was looking for a way to regain control, to pull me back into the family drama she'd authored. I zipped my carry-on shut with a satisfying finality and walked past her, back toward the kitchen. I paused at the counter, right on the spot where she had slid the relinquishment papers toward me just yesterday. From my pocket, I pulled the small, torn stub of the lottery ticket, the part I had kept after giving the main ticket to Miss Albright for safekeeping. I placed it gently on the countertop, a tiny scrap of paper that felt heavier than a block of gold. They both stared at it. Dad squinted, not understanding. But Mom, her eyes wide with a new, dawning horror, slowly reached out and picked it up. She read the numbers, then the date. Last Tuesday. Her gaze shot up to meet mine, a universe of questions in her eyes. I gave her the answer. 18 million, I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. The Mega Millions jackpot. I bought the ticket last Monday. I watched their faces. It was fascinating. The grief and confusion of the last hour were instantly vaporized, replaced by something far more primal and grotesque. It was the shock of a lifetime, a nauseating cocktail of greed, awe, and the most profound, soul-crushing regret I had ever witnessed. Their faces seemed to crumble inward, collapsing under the weight of the number I had just named. $18 million. The daughter they had thrown away, the expensive child they had deemed a bad investment, had become a millionaire overnight. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, broken only by a low rumble from outside. And I'm disappearing at sunrise, I added, turning toward the sound. The taxi was here. Not just any taxi, but a sleek black town car I had ordered that morning, a service recommended by Miss Albright's firm. It sat at the curb, its engine purring, a low and steady thrum of power that sounded like the baseline of my new life. Its headlights cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating the walkway where Dad had hauled my suitcases just the day before. The driver stood patiently by the open rear door, a silent chauffeur waiting to transport me out of this life and into the next. The idling engine was a clock, counting down the final seconds of my past. Everything was ready. My escape was no longer a desperate plan. It was a reality, waiting for me at the end of the driveway with the engine running. The airport departure gate was an oasis of calm anonymity. I sat near the large window, watching planes take off into the dawn sky, my new passport and first-class boarding pass resting on my lap. The hum of the terminal, the distant announcements, the quiet conversations of strangers. It was the perfect soundtrack for a new beginning. I felt a sense of peace settle over me for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The storm was over. I had my money, my freedom, and a future I could finally build for myself. I was so lost in the moment that I didn't see them until they were almost on top of me. They looked frantic, disheveled. Mom's face was puffy and blotched from crying, and Dad's shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed. They must have driven here like maniacs after I left. "Maya!" Mom cried out, her voice a raw shriek that turned heads all around us. They surged forward, a tidal wave of desperation, but their path was suddenly blocked. Two uniformed airport police officers who had been standing discreetly nearby stepped forward to intercept them. My lawyer, Miss Albright, had arranged for an escort. She had anticipated this exact desperate move. "Ma'am, sir, I'm going to have to ask you to keep your distance," the first officer said, his voice polite but unyielding. Dad stopped, stunned. "What is this? We're her parents. We just want to talk to our daughter," he exclaimed, his voice rising in panic. That's when I stood up, calm and collected, and held out the folded document Miss Albright had given me. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying in the suddenly quiet space, "you're not my parents anymore, remember? And this is a temporary restraining order. It says you're legally required to stay at least 100 yards away from me. You are in violation of a court order." "A restraining order?" Mom wailed, her hands flying to her face in horror. The performance was for the benefit of the growing audience of travelers, but the pain behind it was real. This was a public humiliation she couldn't control. "A restraining order against your own family?" "Maya, how could you be so cruel? After everything we did for you, you can't just abandon your family." Her sobs were loud and theatrical, echoing under the high ceilings and the cold, fluorescent lighting. A few people nearby were shaking their heads, tut-tutting at the heartless young woman with the police escort. They didn't know the story. They didn't know the piece of paper she'd signed. They only saw the scene she was creating. The accusation, so utterly hypocritical, didn't even sting. It was like being criticized for your table manners by a cannibal. It was absurd. I had spent my entire life trying to be the perfect daughter, terrified of abandonment, and now she was hurling that very word at me as if it were my original sin. I took a deliberate step forward, stopping just outside the range of her reach, holding up my boarding pass so she could see it clearly. "I didn't abandon anyone," I said, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through her hysterics. "Abandonment is when you drive your daughter to a lawyer's office to be ambushed by a con artist. Abandonment is when you pack her life into 2 suitcases and leave them on the curb for the whole world to see." I looked from her face to my father's. "Abandonment is when you sign a legal document relinquishing all parental rights and tell your child of 23 years that she was just a placeholder." I let the words hang in the air between us. "You didn't just abandon me, you threw me away. There's a difference." The officer beside me shifted his weight. "Ma'am, maybe you and your husband should move back. We don't want to cause a bigger scene." Mom ignored him, her eyes locked on me, her tears suddenly looking like weapons. "It was a mistake. A horrible mistake. We love you, Maya. We've always loved you. We were just so confused." "We made a mistake," Dad pleaded, finding his voice. He stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of supplication. "Chelsea fooled us all. She fooled professionals, Maya. The detectives said so themselves. She was a criminal mastermind. How could we have known?" It was the same tired excuse, the same cowardly refrain. They were victims. They were innocent. Nothing was their fault. He was trying to build a bridge back to me out of our shared trauma, but the foundation was rotten. I wouldn't let him. They weren't just passive victims of a clever con. They were active participants, eager investors in a fantasy that made them feel special, even if it meant erasing me to make room for it. The con only worked because they wanted it to. They had a choice long before Chelsea revealed her true nature. They had the choice between the daughter they knew and the daughter they imagined. They chose the fantasy. "You made a choice," I replied, my voice as cold and hard as the polished airport floor. "She might have been a liar, but she never forced you to do anything. She didn't force you to drain my college fund. She didn't force you to tell me I was no longer welcome in my own home, and she didn't force you to sign those papers." I looked him dead in the eye. "You chose to believe a stranger over the daughter you raised. You chose to gamble and you lost. I'm not Chelsea's victim. I'm your consequence. And now I'm making my choice." The air crackled with the tension of everything left unsaid, of 23 years of history curdling into this one final bitter moment. He opened his mouth to speak again, to plead, to excuse, to deny, but he was cut off by a new voice, a disembodied, cheerful female voice that floated down from the ceiling. "Good morning, passengers. We are now inviting those in rows 1 through 10 to begin boarding for Flight 447 to Zurich." The voice was a starter pistol, signaling the end of the race. It was my cue. This was it. I looked at Dad, at his crumpled, desperate face, and held out my hand. not in reconciliation, but with a single object resting in my palm. A house key. Here, I said. He just stared at it, confused. I won't be needing this anymore. He didn't take it, so I pressed it into his unresisting hand, my fingers briefly touching his for the last time. There was no warmth. Give it to the neighbors when they ask where I went, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper so only he could hear. Or better yet, use it to let yourselves in when you have to figure out how to explain to the whole neighborhood, to all your friends, why your precious real daughter is sitting in a county jail cell instead of painting her new bedroom. I turned without waiting for a reply. The gate agent was smiling, waiting for me. The officers took up positions slightly behind me, a silent official escort clearing my path. I didn't look back. I knew what I would see. Two broken people standing alone in the middle of a crowded airport, finally understanding the true cost of their choices. I walked up to the counter, the light from the massive departure board shining down on me. It listed cities all over the world: Paris, London, Tokyo, Rome. And there it was. Zurich. On time. I held out my passport. The gate agent took it and scanned my boarding pass. As she did, the passport fell open to my visa page. My brand new, long-stay Swiss visa, with my photo and my name, gleamed under the bright lights. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was my future. It was my release. Have a wonderful flight, Miss Maya, the agent said with a professional smile. And for the first time, the name felt completely, entirely my own. The gate agent's voice echoed in my ears, a final benediction. Flight 447 to Zurich, now boarding. I turned my back on them, on the whole sorry spectacle, and walked toward the jetway. I did not run. I walked with a deliberate, measured pace, each step taking me further from the girl who had sat at that kitchen table 24 hours ago, her world shattering around her. The ambient noise of the terminal began to fade, replaced by the quiet, carpeted hush of the corridor. It was a tunnel between worlds. Behind me was a life of conditional love, of being a placeholder, of being weighed and measured and found wanting. Ahead of me was a clean, white canvas and a full set of paints, all of them mine. I could see the sliver of daylight at the far end, the welcoming portal of the aircraft. I didn't look back. I knew, with absolute certainty, that there was nothing and no one back there for me. As I stepped across the threshold onto the plane, a flight attendant greeted me with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard," she said. I found my seat by the window, sinking into the plush leather, and as the cabin door sealed shut with a heavy, satisfying thud, I finally let out the breath I felt like I had been holding for 23 years. I was disappearing into the sky, a ghost, leaving a haunted house behind forever. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my small chalet, overlooking Grindelwald. The air in the Swiss Alps was so clean it felt like a tonic, and the only sounds were the distant, gentle clanging of cowbells and the whisper of the wind through the pines. My mornings were spent hiking the trails that crisscrossed the mountains, and my afternoons were for painting. My easel was set up right there on the balcony, a half-finished landscape of the Eiger's north face, drying in the crisp, clear light. My art was different here. It was bolder, more confident, filled with color and space. It was the work of a person who was no longer afraid to take up room in the world. My fortune, managed by a discreet and fiercely competent team of Zurich bankers that Miss Albright had recommended, was a quiet, self-perpetuating engine of my freedom, the interest alone more than I could ever spend. The trust fund I had established for myself was growing daily, a quiet testament to the life I was building. I learned about my former family's fate through a Google alert my lawyer had set up for me. The headline from their local paper was a masterclass in understated small-town scandal. Local couple charged as accomplices in daughter's nationwide fraud ring. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. The article was brief, but the details, confirmed later in a clipped professional email from Mr. Jones, were devastatingly clear. Chelsea, or rather Sharon, was a professional, and professionals cover their tracks. During her brief, triumphant reign in my old home, she had used their address as the registered base for several of her shell corporations. She had used their Wi-Fi to conduct illicit transactions. She had even convinced Dad to sign a power of attorney form, just a formality for my medical records, Daddy, that she had then used to co sign for a business loan that was immediately defaulted on. They were so blinded by their prodigal daughter fantasy, so eager to prove their devotion, that they had signed whatever she put in front of them. Their bank accounts, which had been linked to hers for household expenses, were now frozen as part of the criminal investigation. They were facing years of legal battles, their assets seized, their reputations in their small community annihilated. They had thrown their real daughter away for a dream, and that dream had turned around and methodically, efficiently, and illegally devoured them from the inside out. They had been so desperate to have a real daughter, they never realized they were simply her last and most gullible mark. Sometimes, usually late at night when the valley is sunk in a deep and profound silence, I find myself thinking about them. The anger is gone, scoured out of me by the wind and the altitude and the simple healing passage of time. All that's left is a kind of detached, anthropological curiosity. My revenge was never the money or the escape. My revenge was letting their choices play out to their natural, ruinous conclusion. I wonder what they do now, rattling around in that house full of ghosts. I wonder if they ever walk past my old bedroom. The door is probably closed, but I wonder if, sometimes, one of them stops, hand hovering over the knob, and wonders about the girl who used to live inside. I wonder if they check the empty room, half expecting to find me there, still waiting for them to choose me.